everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to kick us off for this amazing conversation on Myth or Truth, the leading fundraising trends revealed to grow donor retention. So we are super excited to have some of our good friends here from Dickerson-Bakker. So super excited. They have some awesome little nuggets of wisdom for you guys. So really excited to kick off this conversation. Before we do that, I want to cover just a few ground rules. So feel free to answer any questions, or if you have any questions, to put them in the chat. We will be leaving room at the end for Q&A, so feel free to drop those in the chat, and we'll make sure to get those as well. You can also find the link to this presentation under the resources tab as well, so that will be available to you after this event. So we are super excited that you are here. So feel free, let us know where you're at too. Let us know where you're calling in from. If maybe you're on the East Coast, if you're having some gloomy weather today, I'm right there with you. So feeling, hope you're cozied up with some coffee and a candle and just enjoying maybe some downtime, and hopefully being safe. But yeah, let us know where you're from. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to my good friend and colleague, Eric Tomales. So if you want to go ahead and just kick us off.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, where everyone is all over the world. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so excited to have this conversation today to talk about generosity and being able to help support others and just better our communities. The first thing I just want to say, just want to get off the bat is, my background is a little unique, where I come from the nonprofit space, as well as the tech space, as well as the consultant space. So I can speak a lot of different languages. But at the end of the day, we value the work you guys are doing in the community, and we want you to stay positive and stay focused. And I always like to start with a conversation of just starting with generosity. And I always like to ask our fundraisers, our nonprofit leaders, where did you learn about generosity? And it's like, as a kid, as an adult, as a teenager, as your family, where did you learn about that idea about generosity? Because generosity is very important. It's the core of everything we do here at Virtuous, as well as just support with Dickerson-Bakker and a whole host of other different partners. But when I thought about where I learned about generosity, I learned about it in the Boy Scouts. This simple concept of saying, a scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, taking care of our neighbors. As my friends know, I'm from Pittsburgh, and I grew up watching Mr. Rogers on the television all the time, and being kind and taking care of your neighbor. And I think that's the most important thing for what we do today, is focusing in on that idea of generosity. Allie, I'd go to the next slide, please. And I think through that, in the mindset of this one individual quote, this quote has shaped my view in the past year. And I'll read it for the folks. It's a little small. Is we have to devise means of making known the facts in such a way as to touch the imagination of the world. The world is not ungenerous, but unimaginative and very busy. And that quote is actually from Egalani Jeb, the founder of Save the Children. And if you start digging deeper into that quote, it's 115 years old. It's not something that happened in 2020 or 2022. It's not something recent, right? Like, we all are getting these emails. We have 400 average emails in our inbox on a regular basis, but we need to go and we need to put out fires all the time, professionally and personally. But at the end of the day, our donors are not ungenerous. They're just busy, and they want to be engaged. And you're going to see this in this report that we're going to share here later this morning. And then we'll go to the next slide. The final piece of that is this idea of responsive fundraising. And this is the core of what we do at Virtuous. This is what I love talking about. I evangelize it around the world, our country, to be able to talk about it as much as I can, because this is the ways that we can be able to help grow generosity with our nonprofits. It's through this simple approach of responsive fundraising. And what you're going to see in this report is we're going to listen to who our donors are and identify those key signals and why our donors are contributing to our organization. We're going to connect with them in that personal and automatic way, right? Like, to be able to do it through their channel, whatever's appropriate. And then we'll suggest that next step. Sometimes it's a financial ask. Sometimes it might be just to nurture the camp opportunity and be able to communicate our mission and our story. And we want to learn and test and validate. And that's the core of responsive fundraising. And that's our methodology for all the things we do here at Virtuous. And we have some great partners, and I'd love to introduce our friends here and talk a little bit about the study that they just launched. Derek, one of the namesakes from Dickerson-Bakker. I'd love to kick it off to you, my friend.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here. Good to reconnect with you and our friends at Virtuous, and just looking through the list of folks that are coming on from so many different places and so many different organizations. This is all about our audience today. We're delivering this information, but I think all of you who are doing such good work with organizations all over the country and making a difference in your local communities across the world, across the nation. And our hope is that the information we're able to provide today is going to help you do that better. And so we're really pleased to have you here with us today. Just do a quick introduction. As Eric said, my name is Derek Baker. I'm the president of Dickerson-Bakker. I'm joined here today with two of my colleagues who you're going to get to know a little bit. Amber Christofferson heads up our talent solutions department. She's over our executive search and talent solutions area, and appropriate to have her here today because a lot of the information in this study relates to leadership and staffing and topics along those ways. And I'm also joined by Andrew Olson, who is our Senior Vice President for Fundraising Solutions, and a lot of this is about fundraising. We'll give each of them time to kind of jump in, but say hello, both of you.
Hey, good to be with you all, and very excited to share some of this very meaty information to you guys that I think will help on a number of different levels. So very, very excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, same here. Hey, everybody. Looking forward to sharing insights on leadership and what we're learning about development as well. So looking forward to digging in with you.
So real quick, let me just do a quick intro of Dickerson-Bakker, who we are, for those of you that aren't familiar with us. We're a consulting firm that works with nonprofit organizations around the country. We've been in business about 40 years, and we have about 40 members of our team, all told. Offices in Raleigh and Dallas, but really work all across the country. And you can see kind of the four kind of pillars of service that kind of anchor a lot of what we do. Executive search, talent recruitment, helping organizations, particularly in the fundraising area, fill important key strategic and leadership roles and fundraising roles within their organization. Oftentimes, some of the biggest challenges in organizations are people problems, and so that's part of the equation of how we work with clients, with organizations. Grant services is another. Fundraising solutions encompasses a lot, but it's basically our annual fundraising program. A lot of emphasis on mid and major giving, which we'll talk about today, and then finally capital campaigns. And our overall philosophy is that the equation for success in any nonprofit organization is going to be an equation of three factors: talented people, abundant resources, and effective strategy. And so that's kind of what we press into. We place a high emphasis on learning and evidence and best practices, and so we do a lot of research. We've done a lot of research for our clients. I love in your kind of responsive fundraising diagram. Listen and learn. Were two key ones, and so I often say to folks that if you really want to understand donors, the best way, there's a lot of technology out there available to understand donors. You can do a lot of research, but the best way to get information about your donors is to ask them. And so so surveys and interviews and really kind of talking to donors and getting that information. But a few years ago, right in the heart of COVID, we started doing some market research. Partly it was by necessity. We had clients asking us, "Hey, what's going to happen? What's going to happen?" We had this research division inside our company, so we did a pretty major donor research study right in the heart of COVID to get a sense of what donors were planning and what that was going to have effect it was going to have on giving, and how giving patterns were going to change because of COVID. And so that kind of launched what was for us the start of these external research studies. And now we do 2 research studies per year, major external kind of market research studies. One is a nonprofit leaders research study where we survey, as it says, nonprofit leaders on trends and challenges in the industry, things that folks who are working in the trenches in nonprofit space are grappling with. And then the other study we do every year, which we'll publish this fall, is our annual donor study, where we talk to donors and get an idea of what are they thinking, how are they changing their giving, what do they like, don't they like, so just getting input and getting insights into donors and donors giving. So this study is one of the bigger ones we have done, and it was really based on some kind of intuitive things that we were feeling strongly about, that we had a hypothesis about. I've been, Eric, I checked out, just did a quick check of your LinkedIn, and I think this is your 20th year involved in nonprofit and fundraising, right?
It's been a while. Recovering fundraisers, I like to call myself, right?
Yes, you've got 2 decades in. I've actually just did my 30th year from my first fundraising job. I think, Andrew, you've got a good 20, 25.
I'm right in between the two of you. Yep.
25 years experience, and Amber about 20. I mean, between the 4 of us on this call, we have got about almost 100 years worth of experience working in nonprofits, And one of the things that I think we are sensing is that, as Andrew and I were having this conversation, just as we look back on our career, we're living in this really disruptive time. I think the pace of change that we are seeing in fundraising and in the nonprofit industry has accelerated, like the end of a hockey stick, compared to the first number of years. And I like to say, for probably the last 30 years that I've been in the industry, for almost 25 of those, it seemed like fundraising was a pretty predictable science, right? I kind of joke sometimes, you'd put your 2 bits in the machine and you'd get $1 out. And, it was kind of, a lot of it was direct mail based. You didn't have all the channels you have today and all the different, right? I mean, donors were relatively similar in many different ways. That's not the case anymore. COVID took the kind of disruption and some of the trends, but also pre-COVID, we're in this really disruptive time. And our sense is organizations are having a hard time finding their footing. They're having a hard time finding answers to the questions. And we wanted to dig into that a little bit. And that's really what this study was about. And so we're going to share some of the key findings of this study. And I think it shines a light on a number of different things. But the number one finding I think that we kind of saw is that things are kind of off, Things are kind of off in the industry. Things are not as they should be. The first kind of the first finding was what we call truth number 1 here. We asked survey respondents a pretty general question, right? We said, hey, rate your organization in these 10 different areas. And you can see kind of the 10 different areas on the screen. And by the way, at the end of this session, we're going to let you know how to download the research, the whole report. So you'll get all of this, copy the slides, copy the recording available to you. But these were kind of the 10 things that we asked. And we said, hey, just rate your organization on this scale. Excellent, good, fine, poor. What we found was that fewer than 20% said that their organization was excellent in any of these areas, basically. Think about that. Only a 20% margin of excellence in these 10 areas. 56%, almost 6 out of 10, didn't rate their organization as excellent in any of these areas. 75%, 3/4, said they saw at least one area where their organization really needed some significant improvement. And so I think if there's one of the takeaways of this is there's a lot of work that needs to be done. There's a desire for change and improvement, but we're also finding there's a lot of internal obstacles and a lot of things standing in the way. So that's one of the overall findings that we found, and we're going to dig into more layers of that as we go through this session here today. And then the second piece of the puzzle, I think that we really learned as a second finding in terms of the study, as we're working through kind of what these key truths coming out of the study is the importance of relationship, the importance of connection. And we're gonna talk more about that, and that's going to be kind of in this whole kind of study as we weave through this thing. What we're seeing is this need to go deeper and broader, or deeper with donors, not so much broader, right? There's a strong desire and I think recognition that growth in fundraising, that effectiveness in fundraising in today's era and in the future is going to be tied to Going deeper with donors, which means more retention, more lifting donors, more relationship with donors, more connections with donors, right? More getting advice from donors. When you look at the responsive fundraising matrix, right? It's listen, learn, connect, suggest, right? And those three in particular, listen, learn, and connect, they're so critically important, and organizations need to do a better job of that. Well, one of the key things that we found in terms of the gaps, go back one slide if you might, Allie, that the two top kind of needs in terms of getting meaningful, look at that. Number one, the one that most organizations are struggling with the most, consistently getting meaningful feedback from our donors, right? Listening and learning from our donors. And then the second is having enough qualified staff for effective fundraising. These are two areas that organizations are really struggling with. Across the board, we're seeing a lot of issues. But in these two areas in particular, these were the most consistently highlighted and flagged areas. So we're going to dive deeper into many of these. And to kick that off, I'm going to turn it over to Amber, who's going to talk about a series of truths we found in this study related to leadership. Amber.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. Also a recovering fundraiser over here. So this is really, this piece of the study, really, you can't have the donor retention if you don't have the employee retention. And so this kind of speaks to, a layer of challenges with respect to leadership and retaining good talent. And, this report is important in kind of getting all that information out. As Derek mentioned, there was kind of a feeling that things were off. And I would say too, upon reading this research report myself, it was, hey, yeah, we have felt this tension as an executive search partner with nonprofit organizations. We feel the tension. We can kind of pinpoint it. We know to be successful in search, we have to get the culture fit right. If we don't get that right, it's like, what they say, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? You can have the best looking strategic plan, but if you don't have a culture that is open, safe, I think that you could go back to the steps for virtuous, like the learn, suggest, listen, whatever, would be the same thing here. So we have felt that tension, but this report puts a name to it. And I think by being able to name what these tensions are, we have a better chance of knowing how to tackle it. So these next few slides I'm going to take you through really are different angles. We're going to slice and dice what we got from this section of the research. And so with this truth number 2 is really, we asked respondents, here's 21 options of effective leadership. What would you say are the top 3 that are of importance to you? And of that, our top 3 landed at vision, relationship building, so always going back to relationship, inspiring trust, and communication skills were kind of hand in hand, right? And then the other thing I noticed as I was just kind of digesting the insights from this research is you've got this middle section that falls below that 4th top leadership element. And really that middle section I've often lovingly referring to as MET is all around emotional intelligence. Kind of takes us back to 1995 when emotional intelligence came on the scene, right? Well, what does that mean? It means we're staying curious, not only the leaders, but also us as frontline fundraisers, staying curious, asking the right questions, listening, actively listening, and just being aware, right? Because that creates that safe space that we all want to be in, where we kind of recognize none of us are perfect. We're all doing our best. And if we can all agree on that, that just really kind of creates a different environment for us to do our very important work. So we're going to take another angle of this picture and we're going to move to the next slide.
Well, before we do, Amber, I'd love to just kind of share something on that previous slide there. Is the thing that I love what you just unpacked, right, is if we want to learn, that part of responsive fundraising, we want to test and validate. One of the things that's hard to do in the nonprofit space is we're not Amazon, we're not Google. We can't make quick decisions because we're not using corporate dollars to fund our resources. We're using donor dollars to do this idea, what you just laid into is staying curious and adapting and trying new things. But what's the key there is that third point that you just put out is inspiring trust. If we have trust of our donors that be able to go to our organization, that we can be able to be curious and innovate and try new things, I think we can grow more generosity.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it just has to be, you know, when they say a culture of philanthropy, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is, when you kind of tease that out, what does it actually mean? And I think this is what it means. Those key, I was thinking the same thing too, Eric, you know, those top 3 or 4, you could venture to say, if you asked a donor what's important to them when they're working with a philanthropic organization, they probably would say the same exact thing, or be pretty close, right?
Yeah. And they'll also say the other side is, you know, you've already asked me this question 5 times with the previous 4 gift officers, right? Like, so it goes back to retention of our staff.
Exactly. For sure. Great. So all of these, once we kind of nailed down that top 9 of those key attributes, we then kind of looked at, well, what's the rating within those on current leadership? So we asked, what are the 3 things you'd like to see, or, you know, key elements of leadership? And then how do you rate your current leadership? Where you work now, how do you rate them with respect to these top 9 pieces, right? And this is where it landed on a scale of 1 to 5. We have the top rated being the least important of the 9. And then we have kind of about a 3, 4, again, kind of in the zone with respect to those key attributes. So that's another, just demonstrating that need for those solid communication skills. I can't tell you how many times we enter into a search, and a lot of our due diligence on the front end is meeting with the current staff, that current fundraising team. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, I don't even know why we're recruiting for this position. I don't even know why we would hire one of these and not one of these. I don't even know. So, and then when you ask about what's the communication like between leadership and your fundraising staff, it always leaves a lot to be desired. So this was not shocking when I saw that information. It's communicating back to the staff that's kind of missing. And again, the emotional intelligence piece, right? How do we practice that? It is possible. If someone is strong in a couple areas of emotional intelligence, there are these habits that we can put in place. So again, it's just identifying, like, what are the main needs, and emotional intelligence is another piece. And you could also argue with the remaining that they all kind of blend together in some way, shape, or form. So again, just another angle of the same picture. But if we can go to the next slide, it all leads us to this conclusion, which I think is part of what we feel, that tension. There is a perception divide that exists between CEOs and frontline staffs. It has to do with a lot of the things we've talked about so far, right? Lack of communication, lack of that curiosity on the side of the leader to kind of say, hey, you know, what are you hearing? What are you experiencing? What do you think? Are we measuring the right things? Are we, you know, in this changing environment, you know, and I would say this perception divide happens between board and leadership and staff. So really kind of all of those pieces, there's just some disjointedness that's happening that's kind of creating this perception divide. And that's really what that original data tells us. And then we're going to take this picture and slice it a little bit. So if we move to the next slide, again, what we looked at is how does leadership rate themselves versus how frontline fundraisers rate their leaders. Again, this is just another angle, another picture of that perception divide between the leadership and the frontline fundraisers, right? And I want to make a point here to say too, as we're talking about staff or lower, these are all frontline fundraisers that make up this yellow portion on this slide. And then that light blue is going to be the C-suite. And then the dark blue is just the average of both. But you'll see that where CEOs, leaders are rating themselves a 5 or a 4 to 5, that is not being felt by those frontline fundraisers. And where they're rating a 1 and 2, the leaders are like, well, I actually thought I was doing pretty good in these particular areas. So this is rating on all of those attributes we talked about in those first 2 slides. And this is the difference between how the leader looks at their leadership and how the people being led look at that leadership. And one of the things, I mean, I think we could tease out this information and get a lot more insights just from those few slides alone. But here's another result of this divide. And if we go to the next slide, there's another picture of it. When frontline staff were asked about measuring fundraising health, 80% said, so now we're switching colors. The dark blue is our frontline fundraising staff. 80% said we are focusing on the wrong measure of fundraising health. And then, as you can see, the CEOs, the light blue, only about 50% said that they are measuring, they're using the wrong measurement of fundraising health. So, and this is something I think this has been going on for a long time. Back when I was in fundraising, I remember, as things, I was with United Way, so very transactional, but as things were going from transactional back to relationship, we really felt like we weren't measuring the right things because there was one outcome they were looking for, and that was the bottom line, right? Like, how much have we raised? How far are we behind? What are we going to do? But it really wasn't about the activity or the actual engagement that was going to take place to get us there. That seemed to have no value to leadership, but to the people doing the job on the front line, it has a lot of value, and it's critical to your relationship with donors. So this is, again, just another picture, another result of that divide is we're not even talking about our work and how we measure it. And are we keeping a beat on the pulse of the right things? So I can imagine being back in that role and being really, having leadership focused on one thing, but my job is a completely other thing. It's not being, measured. So those are some of the, insights we received with respect to kind of that, what you all do piece, right? And
Erica, I want to put a big star, if I could, right? Put a big star on this slide, because this to me is a really significant piece of the puzzle, and of why change is so difficult. The old adage, what gets measured kind of is what gets done, and so some of the struggles between kind of where frontline fundraising staff want to go and see where they need to go, but that the disconnect with kind of C-level leadership, that disconnect with C-level leadership actually runs throughout this whole report. It's not just in the area of fundraising, but it's really significant, and probably more significant even in the area of fundraising than in other areas. And so this is a good segue to Andrew, right, to pick up and really dive into some of the fundraising findings that we have here. But I think it'd be good to come back to this kind of issue here when we wrap things up towards the end and talk about what's standing in the way of innovation and change.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So I think this one, and let's camp on it again for a quick minute, because it's we see this sort of disconnect in 2 places here. We see it between CEOs and staff, particularly at this level, on what whether or not we're measuring the right indicators of fundraising health. But then even organizationally, what we saw is a significant number of organizations overall simply said, yeah, we think we're measuring the wrong things. And what's really telling, and I think, if you're hanging out with the Virtuous crew, chances are you actually understand the issue much better than a lot of other fundraisers and CEOs, because I think the likelihood that you engage with the virtuous, responsive fundraising model and their content means that you probably feel this angst as well. But what's very interesting to us is that more than 50% of the organizations surveyed said that their key measure of health is gross revenue. And we all know that like you can goose gross revenue in so many different ways that actually hurt your organization. And so for that to be the measure of success that organizations are tracking themselves against, whether it's your board or your C-suite, or if it's just kind of ingrained in the organization, the fact that half of organizations that responded to the survey said that gross revenue is that measure of success for them is honestly quite frightening, because as we think about it, like when it comes to revenue in general, net revenue is the only number that matters, because it's the only number that you can spend on mission impact, right? And so, we believe that, it's really important to think differently about that. But also revenue, whether it's gross or net, cannot be the only factor that you measure, right? There are so many other things. There's actual mission impact. There's donor retention. There's quality of relationship. And we see relationship threaded through so much of this content. So, we're not advocating for one specific measure over another, but we are very clearly saying gross revenue is a bad idea to be your one KPI for success. And there's definitely a better way to approach this. Ali, could you go ahead and go to the next slide, please?
And Andrew, you and I have talked about this ad nauseum, right? Like, because we believe that it's all about it's retention, it's relationships. Can't look at year over year, because you're right. People can bake out on those numbers this year. And then what happens, right? The chief development officer, the gift officer, whomever, they raise a huge amount of money year over year, make a good resume for them, and then they go to a new organization and do it all over again. But that previous organization is now losing those relationships, right?
Sure. Or even in the last couple of years, right? So if your measure is gross revenue, you're going to tell yourself a story coming out of the pandemic where gross revenue went through the roof for a lot of organizations. And in fact, I was just dealing with this with an organization a few days ago where they said to me, yeah, our numbers coming out of COVID are really bad. And we budgeted for growth compared to the last couple of years. And so, that's what happens when gross revenue is your number. You keep saying, how do I push the top line? How do I push the top line? And you don't necessarily understand the issues and the metrics that are driving those sort of under the hood health indicators. And it really creates an opportunity for you to make bad decisions.
100%.
One of the other things that we saw is, and this one I was actually really glad to see that 94% of all respondents, so whether they were CEOs and CFOs or research folks in the advancement department or frontline fundraisers, 94% said we think that we need to shift our fundraising strategies to something that's more effective. Now, as we define what's more effective, I think you'll all probably resonate with what people said. Ali, if we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So when we asked them, if you believe that you should change, what should you change to? What should we prioritize more? And the overwhelming majority said prioritize retaining and developing your mid-level donors, retaining and developing your current major donors, and then acquiring more of both mid-level and major donors. So no shock there, right? As we see the trend of how giving is changing and the fact that fewer donors who give gifts under, say, $500 are continuing to give right now, whether that's because of the experience they're getting, because of the economy, because of inflation, because of all of those things combined. There are so many different aspects of it, but the reality is lower dollar giving is decreasing, and the individual donors that are sort of covering the spread on that are those who give mid-level and major level gifts. So I'm not shocked to see organizations say, here's the things that we think we ought to be prioritizing more and investing more time, effort, and dollars in. It is interesting to me, though, because we asked the converse of this. We said, if you're going to prioritize these things, what are you going to deprioritize so that you actually have the time, the brain space, the energy, and the budget dollars to do these things well? And Ali, if you'll go to the next slide, please. What they said here, you can see it sort of 2/3 of the way through the page. significant majority of people said in order to prioritize those things that they feel are more important, that they should deprioritize acquiring new mass market donors. And this, again, it's not really a shock, right? And for the Virtuous team and for those of you who might, really ascribe to the responsive fundraising model, it's not going to be a shock to you either, because when we think about how we build and grow relationships, how you develop and nurture those partnerships that lead to really transformational giving, mass market donor acquisition is very far down on the priority list there. It's not to say that bringing new people into your organization as supporters is unimportant, but when you look at the math of how expensive it is to do mass market donor acquisition, how challenging that mass market acquisition space is right now, and the relative, the time that it takes you to go from acquiring a brand new mass market donor to getting a meaningful engagement and donation from that person, and breaking even and generating net revenue. If you compare that to enhancing the relationship you have with a major donor, you will get a lot more money a lot more quickly by prioritizing the latter than the former. So I was excited to see this. I think it's a smart thing that a lot of organizations are thinking about. As we have to make these trade-offs, where's the best place to make this trade-off? And for many organizations, deprioritizing new donor acquisition in the mass market is probably the right place. One of the things that I think we were all challenged by as we saw this is, even though 94% of the respondents said, we think we need to change, and so many said, we think we know how to change, we know what we would change. What was shocking to us is that a full 50% of organizations said, even though we want to change, and even though we've identified the areas where we think we should change, we are not planning to change. And I believe that really probably goes back to just how difficult it can be in organizations to actually lead and push through complex change, particularly when there are so many other priorities, especially if gross revenue is in fact the goal you're being measured against. The idea, to go back to Eric's point earlier, to the idea to take any risk and to try things that might not be immediately net revenue producing or immediately have an ROI of 3 to 1 or better, or whatever the arbitrary measure might be. That kind of risk in a lot of organizations, A, is not supported by boards, B, oftentimes not supported by C-level executives. And because of that, the risk to the frontline fundraiser or anyone in any role in the organization, it's not just about, did I damage my credibility? But for some people, there's even the fear of, am I going to lose my job if I try this and it's not immediately profitable? We often see, and I suspect many of you probably feel this too, we'll see organizations try to do something like this, try to make a change, but 3 months in, someone says, it's not moving fast enough, we're not getting a return quick enough, stop it and go back to how we used to do it, because at least that's predictable. And I think that's a huge challenge for us as we try to evolve with the time and with what's going on with donor behavior and the industry in general, to have our hands tied behind our backs like that and not be able to advance change and test and try new things and be comfortable failing in certain instances so that we can learn and get better. That's going to be a real impediment to growth, both in revenue, but also in mission impact for many organizations. Allie, would you go ahead and flip us forward? So this is another thing that we looked at. We looked at sort of what are those key measures, right? So like I said, half of organizations said gross revenue is what we look at, and it's how we measure success. And it's interesting here because net is on this list, as is retention, but they're both under 25%. However, when we ask them, what would you recommend that your organization measure instead of your current measure? Ali, if you go ahead and flip it. What we see here, I think, is really interesting. And Eric, goes back to your point about sort of, how your responsive model thinks and prioritizes strategy here is 45% of people said, we actually think that donor retention should be the most valuable metric that we're using in an organization. And I think to a good extent, there's probably a lot of validity to that, right? Because it's easier, we've all probably heard this, it's not just easier to get another donation from someone who already supports you, but it's easier to engage them in any number of ways. It's easier to get someone to volunteer. It's easier to get someone to refer you to a friend or a colleague. It's easier to do just about anything with an existing partner. And it's also a lot cheaper to do that than to go out and get new and to grow new and to incentivize someone who's new to do something they've never done before. So the idea of, retaining donors being that key metric, both from a number of bodies on file, if you take it to that very basic metric, but also when you think about how do I retain the revenue? So growing, your gross revenue, particularly if you're doing it through new donor acquisition, that's really expensive growth. Whereas when you retain donors and you build those relationships and you can deepen those relationships and make more significant asks from those people, that's actually what we would call a lot less expensive, a lot cheaper revenue to go get, because the return on investment on it is so much higher. So I love that organizations are thinking about donor retention as being kind of the metric to aspire to. We are hopeful that we can help inspire more organizations to move that along faster.
And Andrew, I love that you're leaning in on donor retention too, because I think through it as we should treat all our donors like major donors within our organization, whether it's a $10 donor or a $10,000 donor. I just use the simple analogy of, as an organizational leader, what would you rather have? 10 donors giving $100 or 100 donors giving 10? And if you don't retain that $100 donor, you lost 10% of your budget or program or impact or mission. But if you lose a $10 donor, you're going to be out there building generosity, telling stories, automating, thanking, appreciating. You're going to find another one to replace the other $10 donor. So I think retention's a really big thing for all donors.
Yeah, you're exactly right, Eric. In fact, we lean deeply into that idea that we should treat every donor like a major donor. I was having a conversation last week with another organization, and we were talking about this very thing. And they said, well, we only have staff who can prioritize 100 relationships, and so we're going to treat those 100 people really well. And I as we started to unpack it, I said, well, we do the things with major donors that we think that they want, because those are the people that we can afford to do it with, right? But if we say to ourselves, major donors want more information about how their gift makes a difference, major donors want more appreciation for their giving, major donors want more access, want to feel like they belong. Mm-hmm. I've never met a donor who gave $25 who said, yeah, I don't really care to know that my gift made a difference, right?
Right.
Or who said, I don't really want to be connected with the cause, or I don't want to be thanked.
Right.
I think we tell ourselves that story because financially and staff time wise, we can only afford typically to engage with those top few hundred donors, or maybe few donors, depending on the size of our organization. But it doesn't mean that a donor who gives less has any less desire to feel like they matter, right?
It's just the three core principles of Penelope Burke's donor-centered fundraising, right? You want to thank, appreciate, share the impact in a timely manner, right? That.
Yep. Well, and
that's really what donors want, right? I mean, that's survey based. That's what donors want. Right? Those are the number 3 things that donors want. And so, to Andrew's point, the idea that this isn't like ideas that we have as fundraisers. This is listening and learning from your donors and what they want. And what they want essentially is more relationship and more connectivity. That's one of the key things that donors are telling us, and that donors, right? We see that in donor studies. We even saw that. Allie, jump a couple of slides forward. Just there's a slide, the relationship changes everything slide. What I think is really interesting, we can go backwards again, and you can jump back, Andrew, in a minute. But this is a good segue to this. That what I found was interesting is that in this survey with folks who are, nonprofit leaders, 56% want to focus more on relationship with mass market donors, right? So that gets to what Andrew is saying, hey, we need to start treating every donor like a major donor. We need to start applying that not just to more major donors. They're actually fairly happy with the relationship they've got with major donors. They're saying we've got to do better at engaging and connecting with mass market donors and mid-level donors, which is a whole different ball of wax than going out and having coffee in Starbucks or taking them out for lunch or going out and visiting. You got to be able to do that on a mass scale. which, fortunately technology allows us to do. But those are trying some new things. But this is the direction that the trends are going. The industry is going in order to grow fundraising today. It really is all about relationship development, connection with donors, personal connection, multi-layered kind of connection, but doing it in a way at scale and not just with that top 1 or 2% of your base. So I skipped ahead there.
No, that's okay. I'm going to camp on this for a second because I think it's really important. This to do what we're talking about, you couldn't do a decade ago. In fact, maybe not even 5 years ago. But because of the way that the access and relatively low cost of data and how that has decreased in the last couple of years, and because of automation platforms like Virtuous, right? When you have those two things in place, you can start to engage any donor in a way that makes it feel deeply personal, even if you don't have a gift officer sitting there personally typing the message to Jane Smith, right?
Right.
But 5-10 years ago, this was just a pipe dream because the technology just hadn't caught up. So it is not just right time because of what's going on economically and in donor behavior, but it's also right time to be thinking differently because the tech has finally caught up and the cost of it has come down enough that you can actually make this viable.
You're so right, Andrew and Derek, because I think through just the technology piece of it all, obviously I'm on the tech side, right? And I had an epiphany a couple of weeks ago when I was talking to an organization. They wanted to start thanking and appreciating their donors through video. And one of the things, and we have a partner that does the video and everything else, but the problem is they have thousands upon thousands of records, and they didn't know how to just take a small bite of that elephant to go through it. And I just suggested, I was like, just look at your entire data set, identify your top first names, right? Like, is it John, Stephen, Susan, whatever it might be. Do a video with those 5 or 6 top names and mass market it into your system to make it look personal that you reached out to them, but you can utilize technology and automation to have that connectedness to it. And that's what's the coolest thing about today's technology out there.
Yeah, the technology is right. I mean, we're getting into this into this kind of where these two things are meeting, and it's fortunate, right, for us, because we're seeing, and a lot of this is driven by generational changes, but expectations. When I walk into a Hilton hotel these days, it's welcome Derek on the TV. There is this level of personalization that is an expectation in society today, and connectedness that people want from their nonprofit. So, we have the donor need and expectation, and we have the technological advancement kind of coming together that allows us to actually make some fundamental changes and innovate and do some really cool things. But this is where I think the disconnect really starts to happen, because I think throughout the industry, we're seeing there's this desire to do some of this, to go in some of this direction, to really change some of the traditional methodology and to innovate. But organizations are running aground in terms of actually executing on those ideas. And I think that, as we kind of come to the last bit on this, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit and shift into some of the underlying conclusions that we found from this study. And I think, to sum it up, it's what we kind of feel like is that, the industry in this moment in time, the nonprofit industry, fundraising in particular, is kind of stuck in this paradox where there's widespread recognition and desire for change, right? 94% of the folks that responded to the survey said they want to see change, they want to see innovation, they want to move forward. But half to 2/3 are saying, but we're kind of stuck on this hamster wheel of doing the same old thing because we can't get these things implemented or executed in our organization. So there are these barriers internally that are kind of standing in the way. And this, I think, is a really significant kind of moment in time for kind of our industry in general, that if we don't find a way to break through these barriers, to begin to at least test and try and do some of these innovations, we're going to be left behind. You know, I saw, some interesting news come out, about Charity Navigators, their new, what do they call that? Causeway, whatever it is, where, right, they're proposing being an intermediary where you can give to a cause and they'll kind of give it out. And, so one of the things that we're seeing a lot today in today's day and age is younger donors are more interested in cause than they are in brand or institution, right? So it's kind of like they're not, the old rules don't apply. And if we as a sector, as an industry, don't get ahead of that, we're going to really, I think, struggle. But the way to get ahead of it is to embrace change and innovation. There is a better way, as Andrew's t-shirt says, but a lot of that it focuses in on, I think, practical things you can do. There's kind of 4 kind of key things that from our standpoint in terms of takeaways from the study. One is really invest in long-term growth of your donors. Like get off of the transactional. What are they given lately? What's the right? Invest in long-term growth. That means putting more into kind of developing middle and major donors and investing in relationship and connectivity. Donor retention is key, right? Retention is king. That's number 1. Number 2, really start to rethink kind of budget and some of those fundamentals, some of those paradigms. Andrew and I have been talking about even, some of the organizational structural things that are standing in the way of change, because so many organizations have these 2 pillars inside the organization, these 2 kind of the silos. One is donor engagement, right? All the mid and major level stuff. And the other is direct response fundraising. Well, we got to bring these 2 together, right? Because we're working on these parallel tracks. And the reality is you're only going to get mass personalization and mass, right, universal connectivity if you can bring those 2 tracks together. So rethinking some of those things, rethinking where you're spending money, rethinking, hey, maybe we need to take money away from acquisition and put it into retention and relationship. The third one, I think, which comes out of here really, which is key, is we need more collaboration with C-level leadership in the fundraising process. It's board level, C-level. Too much, it's kind of like the C-level leadership is saying, you guys raise the money, right? We need X, go raise it. And all they care about is X, right? Or 30% more X than last year. But they have to understand that there needs to be engagement across the organization. And that 4th piece is figuring out where are those barriers internal in the organization. We're going to be pressing into that more industry-wide and we're going to be leading some panel discussions and other things to say, what are those barriers, right? What is really standing in the way? Sometimes it's right. Some of it is the disconnect between leadership and fundraising staff. Some of it is pure bandwidth. Some of it is knowledge. Some of it is right. Just lack of momentum or just fear of failure. But really, we got to identify what are those barriers and how can we begin to take the small bites that can lead to bigger change.
I go back to, I was thinking when Amber was talking about leadership piece, I was thinking back at my experience in some of my nonprofits, and there's absolute the challenge of leadership with frontline fundraising as well as back operations. And one of the things we did at a couple of different organizations is just had skip level meetings. So I got to talk to my boss's boss every 2 months or every 3 months, whatever it might be, because what goes downhill, right? Like, so I get to listen to my boss's boss to understand their vision and their strategy and understand why my boss is the way they are and vice versa. I understand we have to worry about board governance and not get too engaged with the board from a staff standpoint, but I think that is a good tactical way for us to start communicating internally.
Agreed. Do we have any questions from the audience, Eric, that have come through?
I think we have. We've had people keep asking about the PowerPoint. We are going to share the PowerPoint. There's a link here. Ali will show it here shortly. And then Andrew answered the other question about my org is risk averse to hosting donor events. Can I acquire, retain mid-major donors without events?
So the answer is yes. There are a number of Are you going to be able to immediately acquire a donor who gives you 6 figures the first time they talk to you? It's unlikely, right? But it does happen. There are many different ways to acquire donors. Events are one way, direct response is one way, personal referrals is another way. In fact, from your existing best supporters, personal referrals can often be the cheapest way to acquire donors who look and behave like them, and also one of the most effective ways to get people who will stick with you long term. So there are literally dozens of ways to acquire donors. Events are a good way to acquire, higher value donors. They don't tend to give outside of events for the most part. And this is something we see often, right? The channel that someone comes in on happens to be their channel of preference for how they engage with a charity. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a thing. But you don't have to be solely reliant on events.
And I would add to that as well, just add additional layer to that, a couple of additional layers. First of all, I agree 100% with Andrew. One of the best ways to acquire a high value donor is events. Okay. But when we say events, people think galas or big events or golf outings. It's actually the most effective events are the micro events, right?
Yep.
The small group briefing events, the more intimate events, right? And so, kind of rinse and repeat and get those going and get folks. So those micro events are really key. The other thing, because Andrew's exactly right, if you get them into giving at the event, make the event not about the money, but about the connection and the relationship, right? Make the money ask later. Get the relational footing first, right? Use the event to get the relational footing in place, make the event more about the donor than about the organization, right? And then having that follow up and building on that footing, because if it just becomes a fundraising event, then they're just going to wait to give again until the next event. But if the event is an opportunity for introduction, referral, relational connection, and getting to know some folks, and interconnection, right? Not, a good event's going to connect donors on multiple levels. It's going to connect them to staff at different levels, executive leadership, other volunteers, other board members, and begin to drive that sense of belonging that you're part of something, right? You're part of something bigger than yourself that's going to make a significant difference and an impact in the world.
And it's so true, Derek. And I think back, you brought back this small little memory of mine. When I served at the Boy Scouts, I did salon style events, and I kept it true to our mission. I kept it true to our cause. Obviously, we're Boy Scouts, we're outdoor. So what I did is every morning for the entire summer is I invited a potential funder to walk a trail with me and see our day camp and see the program in action and just walk for a mile and walk back. We did it in suits and the whole thing, right? But you then never asked, but it was appreciating, thanking, and getting them to see our mission, because the hardest part as a fundraiser is going and sitting in front of a donor and being able to create that picture of our mission. But to get them to see the mission and to feel it is very impactful. And I think it's not all, for the suggest part of our responsive fundraising, it's not always about the money. It's about getting them engaged, involved, leading into that opportunity to support the organization.
Yeah. I said at the beginning that we do a donor study once a year, and one of those donor studies was particularly focused on major donors. And we asked the question of major donors, how did you first, the organizations, the three organizations that you support the top, set aside your church, because that's a little bit of a different situation, setting aside your place of worship, of the top three organizations you support, how did you get connected to them? And by far, the number one way they got connected was through referral. And the best way to generate those referrals is through those smaller events. You can do it at a higher scale. And so it is one of the kind of magic bullets, for growing. As one of my profound but simple statements that I get quoted on a lot is big gifts add up faster. And if you want more big gifts, you grow more major donors. And the proven most effective way to do that is these micro events.
Well, it reminds me of something that Nathan Chappelle said when we, Derek and Eric, you and I were with him in Texas. He said to a group of folks that generosity is a byproduct of relationship, not the other way around. Right?
Amen.
So if we focus on the relationship first, the other will come.
So true. So true.
Looks like we're getting the hook. Allie's back.
I wish I could keep going. I wish I could. This is so good, y'all. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and just share the findings, share your expertise, and honestly, just create a good conversation around this, because I think that's so needed. And thank you to everyone who joined us today and stayed on. You guys are awesome. I linked the Dickerson-Bakker, the research study that they were referencing throughout their presentation. So please feel free to check that out, download that. We'll be sending a copy of the recording, as well as you're able to download the actual presentation as well. So yes, feel free. We'll be sending that out tomorrow. So reach out with any questions. We want to help. So if there's any questions that you guys have at all, we are happy to be a resource for you guys. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and stay safe.
Thanks so much for having us.
Bye.
Thanks for having us all. Thanks,
Bye.
Eric.
See you, team.